Before we dive into this remarkable story, take a second. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And if you love powerful, thought-provoking stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Trust me, this one is going to stay with you. Now, let's begin. Los Angeles International Airport, better known as LAX, a place where lives intersect, diverge, and transform. The air was thick with energy, the kind only an airport can create. A mixture of excitement, nerves, impatience, and exhaustion. Luggage wheels clattered against polished floors, flight announcements echoed through the terminals, and hurried conversations in different languages blended into a constant hum. Everywhere you looked, people were moving, some sprinting to catch their flights, others pacing while talking on phones, their voices tinged with urgency. Families reunited with tight embraces. Business travelers huddled over laptops, squeezing in last-minute emails before takeoff. This wasn't just a transportation hub. It was a world of its own. And yet, in the middle of all this motion, there was one man who moved differently. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't scan departure boards with restless urgency. He simply existed. Keanu Reeves. Dressed in a worn plaid shirt, faded jeans, and boots that had walked countless roads, he looked like any other traveler. A well-used backpack was slung over one shoulder, the fabric frayed, the strap slightly loose, evidence that it had been through miles of journeys, experiences, and stories untold. No luxury brands, no over-the-top accessories, no air of self-importance. And because of that, most people didn't even notice him. But for those who paid attention, there was something different about him. It wasn't just his face, though some might have recognized it. It was his presence, a calmness that stood in direct contrast to the rush, anxiety, and tension surrounding him. While others sighed in frustration, checked their watches, and impatiently shuffled forward in lines, he remained unbothered, still, composed. There was a kind of effortless confidence in the way he carried himself. Not arrogance, not entitlement, just a quiet certainty, as if he understood something the rest of the world didn't. And soon, someone would take notice, not with admiration, but with disdain, and from that moment forward, things would never be the same. The airport pulsed with unrelenting movement. Announcements crackled over the speakers, luggage wheels rattled, hurried footsteps echoed, and voices clashed in a chorus of departures and arrivals. The air was thick with urgency, passengers checking their phones, sighing impatiently, darting from gate to gate. And yet, one man remained untouched by the chaos. Keanu Reeves. He stood still, not in indifference, but in presence. His gaze drifted across the terminal, taking in the details that most people overlooked. He didn't fidget. He didn't rush. While the world around him was locked in an endless race against time, he simply existed. Occasionally, a few people stole glances in his direction. Some recognized him, but kept their distance, too unsure to approach. Others dismissed him entirely, mistaking his modest appearance for ordinariness. And then, there were those who saw only what they wanted to see. Standing right behind him was Victor Harding, a man who, in every imaginable way, was Keanu's opposite. Victor exuded wealth, status, and the kind of arrogance that came from always feeling superior. His suit, charcoal gray, custom-fitted, was sharp enough to cut glass. The pristine shine of his Italian leather shoes reflected the overhead airport lights. His cologne lingered in the air, a scent that arrived before he even spoke. But what stood out most was the way he carried himself. Victor didn't just stand in line, he owned his space. Everything, from his posture to the way he adjusted his cufflinks, was deliberate, calculated, controlled. He wasn't just waiting for a flight, he was making a statement. I belong here. And then his gaze landed on Keanu. That's when the judgment began. Victor's sharp eyes scanned the first-class passengers, measuring them against an unspoken standard: wealth, status, power. And then he saw Keanu, dressed like he belonged anywhere but here. Victor's smirk curled at the edges. He couldn't resist. "First class, huh?" His voice was smooth, laced with condescension. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu slowly turned his head, his expression calm, unreadable. He met Victor's gaze without flinching, without annoyance, without giving him the reaction he was hoping for. And then, he answered, "Yeah." His voice was even, unshaken. "The world is full of surprises." Victor's smirk faltered, just for a second. He had expected hesitation, an awkward laugh, a flustered explanation. Instead, he got nothing, just stillness. The silence between them stretched, thickening into something unspoken. Victor shifted slightly, his mind already racing for a way to reassert control. He wasn't done. With a forced chuckle, he leaned in just enough to make it personal. "Look," he said, voice smooth but edged with arrogance. "Nothing personal, but you don't exactly fit the typical first-class profile. It's not every day you see someone so casual in a place like this." His eyes swept over Keanu's worn plaid shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. Amusement, judgment, disbelief. Victor was sure of one thing: this man didn't belong here. What he didn't know? He was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. The silence between them stretched, thickening into something unspoken. Victor shifted slightly, his mind already racing for a way to reassert control. He wasn't done. With a forced chuckle, he leaned in just enough to make it personal. "Look," he said, voice smooth but edged with arrogance. "Nothing personal, but you don't exactly fit the typical first-class profile. It's not every day you see someone so casual in a place like this." His eyes swept over Keanu's worn plaid shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed boots. Amusement, judgment, disbelief. Victor was sure of one thing: this man didn't belong here. What he didn't know. He was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Victor reached his seat, glancing down at his ticket one more time to confirm. First class, 3A, a window seat. Perfect. Except it wasn't. Because as he looked up, his stomach twisted in disbelief. Keanu Reeves was settling into the seat right next to his. Victor froze. His fingers clenched around his boarding pass. His breath hitched. For a moment, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. And then, "You've got to be kidding me." The words slipped out under his breath, but the frustration was unmistakable. With a shallow sigh, he dropped into his seat, shaking his head like he was the victim of some cruel joke. "Of all the places possible, it had to be here," he muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Keanu, as always, remained calm, composed, unshaken. He turned to Victor with that same quiet, polite smile. "Looks like we're traveling together then." His voice was even, unbothered, effortlessly cool. Victor folded his arms across his chest, shifting in his seat. This wasn't just about sitting next to Keanu. It was about sharing an exclusive space with someone he had already decided didn't belong. And yet, there he was, completely unfazed, completely at ease. The cabin filled with the murmurs of passengers settling in, the quiet clinking of glasses as flight attendants prepared for takeoff. But Victor, he kept stealing sideways glances at Keanu, trying, desperately, to find something that would validate his initial assumptions. Something that would make this man less than. But no matter how hard he looked, he found nothing. And that was the most unsettling part of all. It wasn't just the fact that Keanu was sitting next to him. It was the discomforting realization that the man Victor had judged so quickly, dismissed so easily, was now sharing the same exclusive space. And somehow, that felt wrong. Victor couldn't explain why, but something about Keanu's presence unnerved him. It wasn't his appearance, it wasn't his words, it was his stillness, the effortless way he sat, unbothered, as if he belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. The last of the economy passengers boarded. The flight attendants secured the cabin doors, and the final safety checks were completed. The low hum of the engines signaled their impending departure. Victor shifted in his seat. The silence was unbearable. He needed to break it. Not because he wanted to talk, but because he needed to confirm what he already believed. With a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, he turned toward Keanu. "So, what do you do for a living?" His tone was casual, too casual, the voice of someone who already knew the answer and was only asking for validation. Keanu, still calm, still composed, adjusted the strap of his backpack beneath the seat before looking up. He studied Victor for the briefest moment, as if deciding whether the conversation was worth having. Then, in a voice devoid of arrogance or urgency, he simply said, "I work in film." Victor's eyebrow arched, his smirk widening. "Oh yeah?" He leaned in slightly. "What kind of film work? Commercials? Small-time projects?" His tone was light, amused, dismissive. Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. "Something like that," he replied, offering nothing more. Victor leaned back unimpressed. "Interesting." He filed Keanu away in his mind under the category of ordinary. What he didn't know? That assumption was about to shatter. Keanu tucked his backpack beneath the seat, settling in. He seemed perfectly at ease, as if the conversation already didn't matter. Victor, on the other hand, was far from done. He wasn't just trying to figure Keanu out. He was trying to fit him into a box. "I work in film," Keanu had said. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh, I see," he said, feigning realization. He leaned toward Keanu, his smirk sharpening. "Commercials? Small-time stuff?" The way he said it, the subtle tilt of his voice, the slight smirk on his lips, it wasn't curiosity. It was condescension. Keanu just gave a slight, patient smile, a slow shake of the head. Something like that. That should have been the end of it. But Victor wasn't satisfied. He let out a soft, amused chuckle, shaking his head as if he had figured something out. "You know," he mused, his voice dripping with arrogance, "I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place." He gestured vaguely around the first-class cabin, the luxury seats, the high-end passengers. But sometimes certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance. His words hung in the air. A challenge. A test. Keanu turned to look at him. Really look at him. His gaze was unreadable, not annoyed, not angry, just thoughtful. He let the silence stretch, as if weighing his response. Then finally, in his usual composed tone, he said, "I think we all have our place." His eyes met Victor's, calm, unwavering. "And sometimes, it's exactly where we are." Victor scoffed, a light, disbelieving laugh. "That's cute," he said, shaking his head. "But real life doesn't work that way." Keanu didn't react. Not with irritation. Not with defense. He simply turned back to the window, his gaze drifting toward the clouds as if they were far more interesting than the conversation at hand. That silence, that unshaken, effortless silence, only seemed to frustrate Victor more. Keanu's voice was steady, almost effortless. "Sometimes it's exactly where we are." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Victor let out a short, dismissive laugh, shaking his head. "That's nice. Kind of philosophical, even." He leaned back in his seat, crossing one leg over the other with a smug grin. "But real life isn't that simple." Keanu didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't argue. Instead, he turned toward the window, his expression unreadable. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. But Victor? Victor wasn't done. The silence bothered him. The lack of reaction infuriated him. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but keeping the edge of arrogance intact. "You know what?" he mused, his smirk growing. "You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy." He paused, letting the words sink in. Some places will never really belong to certain people. It was meant to be a jab, a cutting remark disguised as casual observation. But this time, Keanu didn't respond with words. Instead, he turned and looked at Victor. Really looked at him. Not with anger, not with irritation, but with a quiet, unwavering patience, a look that held depth, experience, a silent wisdom that couldn't be taught, only earned. Victor's smirk faltered. For the first time, he felt something unexpected, a flicker of discomfort. Keanu's gaze wasn't aggressive, it wasn't a challenge, but it spoke volumes. It said, "I see you." And somehow, that was far more unsettling than anything Victor had expected. Keanu's expression remained steady, unshaken. It wasn't a look of superiority or defiance. It was something far stronger. Certainty. An unshakable confidence that seemed to transcend the moment itself. Victor shifted in his seat, just slightly, but it was enough. Enough to reveal that, for all his arrogance, something about Keanu's presence unnerved him. He didn't like it. So, instead of addressing the feeling, he smirked and leaned back, convincing himself that he had won, that he had successfully boxed Keanu in, that he had maintained control. What Victor didn't realize? Things were only just beginning. He thought he controlled the narrative. But in reality, he was playing a game he didn't even understand. With each passing minute, what started as a simple exchange of words was evolving into something far more significant. A lesson was unfolding, one that Victor was completely unprepared for. The low hum of the engines deepened as the plane ascended, the world shrinking beneath them. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, preparing for in-flight service, but Victor barely noticed. Instead, he found himself glancing at Keanu once more, still trying to make sense of him, still trying to figure out why he couldn't shake the feeling that his seatmate's simplicity was far more complex than it appeared. The plane cruised smoothly through the sky, the soft hum of the engines creating a steady rhythm. Overhead lights cast a warm glow across the first-class cabin, where passengers settled into luxury, some immersed in books, others reclining comfortably, sipping their drinks. The in-flight service had begun. A flight attendant moved gracefully through the aisle, her presence professional, her movements efficient. She stopped beside Victor's seat, offering a polished smile. Victor, always eager to make an impression, leaned back slightly, exuding confidence. With an easy smirk, he raised a hand. "A glass of champagne, please. Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." His voice was smooth, dripping with self-importance. It wasn't just about the drink. It was about the statement. The flight attendant, accustomed to requests from the elite, nodded politely. Without hesitation, she poured the golden liquid into a crystal flute and handed it to him. Victor accepted it with a satisfied air, lifting the glass slightly before taking a slow, deliberate sip. And then, he glanced around, making sure people noticed. After all, what was the point of luxury if no one was watching? When it was Keanu's turn, he looked up at the flight attendant with a gentle, polite smile. "Just water, please." Victor's head snapped toward him, his eyebrows lifted in disbelief. A chuckle slipped from his lips before he even realized it. "Water?" His voice carried that unmistakable mix of amusement and condescension. "Don't tell me you're going to waste a first-class experience with water." Keanu didn't even blink. He accepted the bottle with a nod, twisting the cap open effortlessly. Then, with the same serene ease he had carried throughout their entire interaction, he said, "I'm fine with this. Sometimes, simplicity is enough." Victor's smirk faded, just slightly. For a second, it was unclear whether he was more annoyed or confused. Was Keanu serious? Was this some kind of joke? Victor studied him, searching for mockery, for insecurity, for anything that would make sense of the situation. But Keanu simply took a sip, unbothered, unshaken, completely at peace. And that was what made Victor feel uneasy. Victor let out a scoffing laugh, shaking his head as he swirled the champagne in his glass. Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience of flying first class with water. His words weren't just amusement anymore. They were bait. Keanu took another sip, his movements slow, deliberate. Then, with that same calm certainty, he repeated, "I'm fine with this." He let the words settle for a moment before adding, "Sometimes, simplicity is enough." Victor's smirk twitched. He narrowed his eyes as if trying to dissect Keanu's response, trying to decide whether this man was truly content with something so basic or if he was simply pretending. He drummed his fingers against the armrest, then leaned in slightly. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less." The smirk returned, sharper than before. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer. The insult hung in the air. A few passengers nearby glanced over, their interest piqued. The energy in the cabin had subtly shifted. They could feel the tension brewing. Keanu? He didn't react immediately. Instead, he simply lifted the bottle, took another slow sip, and let a quiet pause stretch between them. Victor shifted slightly. For reasons he couldn't explain, that silence felt uncomfortable. It was as if Keanu's lack of reaction spoke louder than words ever could. The more Victor tried to assert his dominance, the more his words seemed to slip into emptiness. And slowly, the realization crept in. This wasn't a conversation. It was a lesson. One that Victor had no idea he was about to learn. The cabin had settled into a comfortable quiet, the kind of silence that came with the steady hum of an airplane in flight. Passengers relaxed, reading, sipping their drinks, or dozing off. But in row 3, the atmosphere was different. Victor's voice had started to carry. His tone, increasingly pointed and provocative, was drawing subtle attention. Nearby passengers stole discreet glances, sensing the tension but choosing to remain uninvolved. Not because they weren't interested, but because Keanu Reeves wasn't bothered. He sat there, unshaken, composed, and effortlessly calm. That presence alone was enough to diffuse the tension before it could escalate. And then, finally, Keanu broke the silence. Maybe the best is different for everyone. His voice was steady, unforced, not defensive. Just true. Victor didn't like that answer. His lips pressed into a tight line as he took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. His ego wouldn't let him retreat, not now, not when he was convinced he was winning. With a smug grin, he leaned back slightly, arms folded across his chest. Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters. A pause. Then, with a deliberate glance at Keanu's simple attire, he added, "Some things are beyond the reach of certain people, you know." The words were a dagger, coated in wealth, privilege, and carefully disguised superiority. Victor leaned back in his seat, satisfied, convinced that he had just put Keanu in his place. What he didn't notice? The subtle shift in the energy of the cabin. A few rows ahead, a flight attendant was serving drinks when she caught a glimpse of their interaction. Something about the body language, the unbalanced dynamic, made her pause. For a moment, she considered stepping in. But then, she looked at Keanu, and in that instant, she knew. He didn't need saving. There was no irritation in his posture, no tension in his expression. He sat with the kind of effortless control that made arrogance look exhausting. So she moved on. Whatever was happening in row 3, Keanu had it handled. Keanu took another slow sip of his water, his gaze drifting toward the window, as if he were thinking about something far more interesting than the cheap insults being thrown his way. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time, Victor felt it. That unsettling realization that no matter what he said, no matter how hard he pushed, Keanu wasn't engaging, wasn't fighting back, wasn't giving him what he wanted. Victor shifted in his seat, trying to suppress his growing frustration. This was new. His usual tactics, condescension, arrogance, veiled insults, should have worked by now. But with Keanu, it was like trying to throw punches at the ocean. Everything just slid right off. Still, in Victor's mind, he convinced himself he was winning. After all, wasn't he the one controlling the conversation? Wasn't he the one who had status, power, and experience? But what he didn't realize, what everyone else around him could already see, was that this wasn't a battle. This was a lesson, and he was on the wrong side of it. A few passengers exchanged quiet glances. Others, while pretending not to notice, had clearly been listening, and it was becoming painfully obvious. Keanu's unshakable calm radiated quiet confidence. But Victor's relentless need to assert himself? That only highlighted his insecurities. And though Victor didn't know it yet, this flight was about to teach him something he would never forget. The energy in the cabin had shifted. Passengers weren't just overhearing anymore. They were listening. The tension, once subtle, had begun to fill the space between every exchanged word. The flight attendant returned to their section, gracefully refilling drinks. As she leaned in to pour another glass of champagne for Victor, he seized the moment. Another opportunity. Another attempt to assert himself. Victor swirled the golden liquid in his glass, watching how the light caught its movement. Then, with a measured smirk, he spoke. "You know, life is a lot like flying first class." His voice carried a deliberate ease, the practiced tone of a man who had delivered many lectures on success. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. A pause. For effect. Then, he turned to Keanu. His eyes held a quiet challenge. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky. The words landed like a slow-burning ember. Victor expected the usual. A dismissive shrug, a polite smile. Silence. But this time, something changed. Keanu, who had been quietly minding his own business, placed his water bottle gently on the tray table. And then, he turned. Slowly. Deliberately. His face was as calm as ever. But his eyes. Something had shifted. A quiet intensity, a subtle firmness, not aggressive, not confrontational, just certain. And Victor saw it. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, intentional, measured. Keanu wasn't rushing. He was letting Victor feel it. And in that moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Victor had been expecting another passive response. Instead, he was met with something he couldn't ignore. Keanu's voice, when it finally came, was serene but firm. A quiet storm behind still waters. Luck or hard work, he said, his words deliberate, each syllable placed with meaning. Then, a slight pause. We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we? The words settled over the cabin like a quiet revelation. Not forced, not defensive, just true. And somehow that made them hit even harder. Passengers who had previously pretended not to listen now exchanged subtle glances. The murmurs, the clinking glasses, the ambient noise of a first-class flight. All of it faded. For the first time, Victor had nothing to say. He forced a smile, tried to brush it off, tried to convince himself that Keanu's words hadn't touched something deeper. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his cufflinks, his posture, his entire demeanor, anything to regain control. With a nervous chuckle, he finally responded. Well, I wouldn't say that. His voice wasn't as smooth as before. It held a slight hesitation. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Another pause. Then, he added with a weak smirk. Not everyone can understand what it means to be truly successful. But something was different now. For the first time, his words didn't land the way he expected. Keanu didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't react. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged. as if he had heard these exact words 1,000 times before. Victor, sensing the growing attention of the passengers around them, straightened his posture, desperate to reclaim the moment. But deep in his eyes, beneath the smirk, the bravado, the performance, there was something else. A flicker of something new. Doubt. Victor leaned back in his seat, his smirk still firmly in place. On a higher level, he repeated, savoring the phrase like a fine wine. His fingers lightly traced the rim of his champagne glass as he gestured around the luxurious first-class cabin. Not everyone understands the value of being here. His voice carried a deliberate air of superiority. Because in his mind, wealth wasn't just about comfort, it was about separation. Keanu, still calm and composed, slowly leaned forward. He crossed his arms, not defensively, but in a way that was relaxed yet assertive. Then, with quiet certainty, he spoke. "I think the value of being here," he paused, gesturing subtly around their seats, "isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat others." The words landed with an undeniable weight. A simple statement, but one that cut deeper than Victor expected. For the first time, Victor didn't have a quick response. A few passengers who had been quietly observing exchanged approving glances. Some even nodded in agreement. The energy in the cabin shifted, and suddenly Victor didn't feel as comfortable as he had before. He forced a chuckle, light, dismissive, trying to break the tension. "That's a good one," he said, waving a hand as if brushing off the conversation. "First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should write a book." But his voice? Slightly strained. The confidence he had oozed so easily before, the arrogance, the certainty, it was fading, because Keanu wasn't just holding his own, he was winning. And worst of all, he wasn't even trying. Victor shifted in his seat, adjusting his cufflinks, his tie, his posture, anything to regain the illusion of control. But the quiet support from other passengers, the way Keanu remained unshaken, effortlessly composed, it was becoming impossible to ignore. Victor smirked again, desperate to reclaim his footing. "You should consider giving motivational talks," he quipped, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He was still reaching, still pushing, still hoping to get some kind of reaction. But Keanu? He just gave a short, polite smile. Then, he turned back to face forward. Conversation over. Victor blinked. That was it. That was it. No argument. No rebuttal. No need for another exchange. Because Keanu had already won. And somehow, the silence that followed carried more weight than any words ever could. The passengers around them had noticed. Some whispered quietly, exchanging amused glances. Others shot Victor subtle looks of disapproval. Not aggressive, not hostile, but enough for him to feel the shift in perception. His arrogance, once a badge of confidence, was now turning against him. And for the first time, Victor felt it. A couple sitting a few rows behind stole a discreet glance at Keanu. They recognized him, but they didn't approach, didn't interrupt. They simply watched in admiration, impressed not by his fame, but by the way he had handled the situation with such quiet dignity. Meanwhile, Victor sat stiffly in his seat. He could feel the weight of his own words pressing down on him. The tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw, all revealing a discomfort he couldn't shake. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't in control, and he had no idea how to handle it. The couple seated a few rows behind exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had been watching, not just the conversation, but the contrast between the two men. The difference was undeniable. Keanu had handled every insult, every condescending remark, with patience, grace, and an unshakable quiet confidence. Meanwhile, Victor was beginning to feel it, the weight of the passengers' gazes. It started as a creeping awareness, and then it became undeniable. People weren't looking at him with admiration. They weren't impressed. They were watching, and not in the way he was used to. the whispers, the subtle glances, the knowing nods. They weren't signs of respect, they were signs of judgment, of disapproval, of a realization that had begun to settle over the entire cabin. Victor wasn't winning. His once upright, self-assured posture shifted slightly, arms crossed, then uncrossed, fingers adjusting his tie needlessly. The heat crept up his neck, but his pride wouldn't allow him to acknowledge what was happening. Not yet. He still believed he could regain control, still believed he could turn this around. But what Victor didn't realize, the more he spoke, the more he revealed about himself, and the less impressive he seemed. And what was coming next would shatter everything he believed about status, power, and respect. A few seats away, the flight attendant moved down the aisle, collecting empty glasses. Victor saw his moment, a chance to redirect the conversation, a chance to reclaim his dominance. He cleared his throat, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to launch yet another remark, unaware that the lesson he was about to learn would be one he'd never forget. Victor, still convinced he could turn the tables, leaned in slightly. A smug grin curled at the edges of his mouth. His final play. "You know what's funny?" he said, swirling the last drops of champagne in his glass. "People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity." He paused, letting the words sit there. Then, with a knowing smirk, "Ever noticed that?" The trap was set. The words designed to cut, designed to finally push Keanu into reaction. But Keanu, he didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't show a single trace of irritation. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. And for the first time, he met Victor's gaze with a quiet intensity. The air felt heavier, the space between them tighter. And then, he spoke. "I've noticed," Keanu said. His voice was calm, steady. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he added, "that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have." A brief pause, a silence that commanded attention. "Are the ones who feel the emptiest inside." The words didn't just land, they echoed, hung in the air like an undeniable truth. And this time, Victor had nothing, no quick retort, no smug comeback, no condescending laughter. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, blinking. His confidence faltered for the first time. Keanu's words had touched something deeper than he was willing to admit, and for a moment, just a moment, Victor was stunned. Passengers nearby glanced up from their screens or books, their curiosity fully piqued. The silence grew heavier. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, desperate to regain his footing, to say something, anything. But Keanu? He simply leaned back, expression unchanged, as if he already knew how this would end. The tension in the cabin became palpable. And in that moment, Victor finally began to realize something. He wasn't as in control as he thought, and for the first time in his life, he might not even be in control at all. Victor sat there, his mind racing for a comeback. But for the first time, the words didn't come easily. He could feel it now, the weight of the passengers' glances. Some were impressed by Keanu's effortless ability to deflect every provocation without breaking a sweat. Others, amused, not by Keanu, by Victor. Because no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many words he threw out, he wasn't winning, and it was obvious. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice carrying a forced, uneasy lightness. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," he said, his tone noticeably less assured than before. "But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." He waited, hoping to tilt the power back in his favor. Keanu didn't rush to respond. Instead, he leaned back, his posture composed and thoughtful. And then, with quiet certainty, he said, "Maybe." A slight pause. Then, but I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself. The words landed like a slow-building ripple, a gentle, undeniable truth spreading through the cabin. A few passengers nodded discreetly, their silent agreement further solidifying the shift. Keanu's words didn't just challenge Victor, they challenged everything he stood for. And suddenly, Victor felt it, the weight of eyes on him. Not in admiration, not in respect, but in disapproval. Victor forced a smile, scanning the cabin, trying to regain some sense of control. But the dynamic between him and Keanu had shifted, and for the first time, he realized it. His usual tactics weren't working. And worse, somewhere deep inside, he couldn't ignore the truth behind Keanu's words. They didn't just challenge his argument, they challenged his identity. A subtle murmur moved through the cabin. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, some with quiet agreement toward Keanu, others with subtle disapproval toward Victor. By now, people weren't just eavesdropping, they were fully tuned in. An older gentleman seated nearby shifted, turning slightly to observe more closely. A small shake of his head, a clear judgment of Victor's behavior. Victor felt the shift, the weight of stares pressing in. His usual confidence, so effortless, so automatic, was now starting to crack. His fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted his cufflinks. He sat up straighter, masking his unease. But it was there, visible in the tension in his shoulders, the way he forced his smirk rather than wore it naturally. And yet, instead of backing down, he doubled down. Because for Victor, admitting he was wrong was never an option. With a scoff, he waved a dismissive hand. "Cheap philosophy," he sneered. The words came out sharper than he intended. He knew it, and so did everyone else. Still, he pushed forward. "It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way." His voice carried traces of arrogance, but there was something else underneath it now, a hint of defensiveness, like he was trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince Keanu. Keanu, unshaken, unbothered. He simply turned his gaze back to Victor, his expression calm but unwavering. No need for a rebuttal, because at this point, his presence alone challenged everything Victor thought he knew. Keanu's gaze remained steady, calm, unshaken. And then, with the same signature tranquility, he spoke. "The real world is made by people, Victor. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else." The words weren't meant to be cutting, but they were. Victor visibly tensed, a subtle, involuntary reaction. He shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering as the weight of Keanu's words pressed down on him. And then, he noticed it. The passengers. The silent jury. What once felt like admiration now felt like judgment. The quiet whispers, the exchanged glances, the subtle stares, some filled with curiosity, others with disapproval. Victor had entered this exchange believing he was in control, that he could dominate the conversation like he always had, because money, power, and status had always guaranteed him the upper hand. But no matter how hard he tried to reassert control, Keanu's unwavering composure was shifting something far greater than just this conversation. It was shifting the power dynamic in the entire cabin. And for the first time, Victor felt it. The creeping, uncomfortable realization that perhaps success wasn't about what he had always believed. And perhaps he was losing in a way he had never lost before. Victor had always believed that in conversations like this, he held the upper hand. That wealth, power, and status could easily overshadow others. That confidence alone could dictate how people saw him. But this was different. Keanu's words weren't just changing the perception of the passengers. They were starting to chip away at Victor himself, leaving him feeling something he wasn't used to, something unexpectedly vulnerable. The tension in the cabin was thick. Victor crossed his arms tightly, an attempt to mask the discomfort creeping into his system. But his body language betrayed him. The tightness in his jaw, the stiffness in his posture, the irritation in his eyes. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the weight of the unspoken judgment around him. And yet, Keanu remained the same, completely unaffected, completely at ease. He didn't need to prove anything. And that, more than anything, was what made Victor's own words feel hollow. A moment of silence stretched, thick, heavy, undeniable. Then, Keanu turned to him, and with genuine understanding in his voice, he spoke. "You know, Victor," he said gently, his tone steady. "I understand what you're saying. The world can be very competitive." Victor's brow furrowed slightly. He wasn't expecting that. Keanu wasn't fighting him. He was agreeing with him. But then, Keanu continued. A pause, just long enough to let the words sink in. Then, soft, steady, certain. "But I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper. And that landed harder than anything else." Victor's expression shifted. He was listening now, not because he wanted to argue, but because he had nothing to say. For the first time, he wasn't at war with Keanu. He was at war with himself. Keanu's voice remained steady, unwavering, measured. The kind of tone that didn't demand attention, but effortlessly commanded it. "Something deeper," he continued. A pause, then an insecurity, an inner struggle. Victor's brow furrowed. For the first time, he wasn't just annoyed, he was caught off guard. His instincts screamed at him to push back, to laugh it off, to regain control. Because if there was one thing Victor Harding didn't do, it was losing. With a forced chuckle, he scoffed. "Inner struggle?" His voice carried a sharp edge, an almost defensive bite. He waved a hand dismissively. "I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong." The words should have sounded confident, but something about them wavered. Keanu didn't press, didn't argue. Instead, he just offered a knowing smile, a look that wasn't judgmental, just understanding. And then softly, he said, "Maybe." Another pause. Then, "But I've met many people who thought success was all about what others could see." His eyes met Victor's. Steady, honest, inescapable. Deep down, they were just trying to fill something missing inside them. And that was the moment Victor's forced smile faltered. The moment the armor cracked. He tried to ignore it, tried to shake it off. But then, without realizing it, his fingers instinctively reached for his wedding band. Fiddling with it. Turning it slowly. A subconscious habit. A telltale sign that something Keanu had said had struck a nerve. The silence that followed was thicker than before. It wasn't just about status anymore. It wasn't about winning. It was about something else. Something Victor wasn't ready to face. And yet, it was already creeping in. For a brief moment, his carefully curated persona of wealth, control, and success seemed to crack. And beneath it, something far more human, far more vulnerable, but just as quickly as it appeared. Victor forced himself to brush it off. He straightened in his seat, unwilling, unable to admit that Keanu's words carried weight. Victor's fingers continued turning the wedding band, almost absent-mindedly, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. But then, he snapped back, like a man waking from a dream he didn't want to acknowledge. His shoulders squared. His smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's not me," he said firmly. But the words, they came out too quick, too sharp, as if he was trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince Keanu. "Everything I've achieved, I worked hard for it." His voice was harsher now, more defensive. "I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life." The irritation was there now. But it wasn't just annoyance at Keanu. It was something deeper, something Victor wasn't ready to name. Keanu didn't react with judgment or challenge. He simply watched, his expression thoughtful, as if he was carefully choosing his next words. Then, after a long, meaningful pause, Keanu spoke. "I'm not saying you didn't work hard." His voice was even, measured, gentle. "I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of showing off what we've achieved." He glanced around them. The luxurious seats, the champagne glasses, the exclusivity. Then, he asked the question Victor didn't want to hear. "Who are we without all of this?" The words landed like a punch Victor never saw coming. His jaw tightened. His fingers stilled over his wedding band. He pressed his lips together. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate response. His mind raced, searching for something, anything to counter with. But there was nothing. Because this wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a mirror. And Victor was seeing a reflection he wasn't ready to face. Victor shifted in his seat, his discomfort now impossible to hide. Keanu's words lingered in his mind, echoing louder than he wanted them to. Who are we without all of this? The question struck something he wasn't ready to face, but admitting that? Not an option. He let out a cynical laugh, shaking his head. "Who are we?" he repeated, his tone sharper now, more defensive. Then, with forced conviction, he answered, "We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing." The words came out too fast, as if he was trying to convince himself just as much as he was trying to convince Keanu. But Keanu didn't flinch, didn't waver. Instead, he held Victor's gaze. And this time, his expression wasn't just calm, it was firm, unshaken, certain. "I disagree," he said, his voice carrying a quiet weight. The softness that had once laced his tone was now replaced by conviction. "I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate." He paused, not for effect, but for truth. Then he pointed to his chest. "In the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside." The words settled over the cabin like a quiet revelation. Passengers who had been silently listening exchanged glances. Some nodded subtly in agreement. Others looked down, their expressions thoughtful, as if Keanu's words had reached them too. But Victor, he was struggling. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to counter, as if to find some clever rebuttal. But no words came. His confidence had been a fortress, built brick by brick from status, wealth, and control. But now it felt like those walls were cracking. And the worst part? People were watching it happen. Victor looked around and felt the shift. The way the passengers were looking at Keanu with admiration, and the way they were looking at him with something else entirely. Victor struggled to hold on to his composure, the usual confidence, the effortless smirk, the certainty. It was slipping. And Keanu's calm, measured presence only made it harder to maintain the facade. Frustration bubbled just beneath the surface, and for a moment, just a split second, he nearly rose from his seat in protest. "That's easy for you to say," Victor snapped, his voice sharper now, tinged with irritation. He was losing control, and he knew it. "You don't know anything about me." The words came out too fast, almost desperate. "You don't know what I've been through to get here." His tone wasn't just defensive anymore. It was pleading. Because this wasn't just an argument anymore. It was personal. Keanu, however, remained composed, unshaken, still. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm, but not unkind. "You're right, Victor," he said. "I don't know your story." A pause, letting the words sink in. Then he continued. "But I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes, when someone feels the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're trying to hide something." Victor's breath caught. The words hit like a brick. But Keanu wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, not as a challenge, but as a quiet truth. And then softly, He said it. Fear, insecurity, loneliness. The words landed like a hammer. Victor froze. For the first time in the entire conversation, he had no comeback, no rehearsed speech, no smug remark, just silence. A silence that grew heavier with every passing second. Passengers around them sensed it. The shift. The moment where Victor had nothing left to say. Some leaned in slightly. Others glanced up from their books, their screens, fully invested now. Victor's hands clenched into tight fists on his lap, his knuckles white as he struggled to find something, anything, to say in response. But deep down, he already knew. Keanu's words had struck a nerve he wasn't ready to confront, and for the first time in his life, Victor Harding had no control. Something flashed across Victor's face. Anger, but not just anger. Something deeper, something he didn't want to name. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The frustration had been boiling beneath the surface for too long. And now, it erupted. With a sudden, forceful movement, Victor shot to his feet. The motion sent his empty champagne glass crashing to the floor. The sharp clatter echoed through the cabin. A few passengers gasped. Others turned fully in their seats. Now? Now it wasn't just a conversation people were casually listening to. Now, it was a scene. Victor's breath came sharp, fast, unsteady. His chest rose and fell as if he had just sprinted miles. Then, his voice, raw, trembling with a mix of frustration and desperation, filled the cabin. "You think you're better than me?" His words sliced through the thick silence. He pointed a shaking finger at Keanu. Accusing. Desperate. Sitting there with your clever little phrases, acting like you know everything about life. His voice rose, filled with something that wasn't just anger, but something deeper. Something close to fear. But you don't know a thing about what it's like to live in the real world. The cabin fell into an eerie stillness. Every passenger stared openly now. No more discreet glances. No more murmurs. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes a man realize he's standing alone. A flight attendant, her uniform crisp and professional, quickly stepped forward. Her voice was calm but firm. "Sir, please lower your voice." She wasn't aggressive. She was giving him a chance. Her gaze darted between Victor's clenched fists and Keanu's steady, unbothered presence. Victor's breathing was ragged. His shoulders rose and fell, as if he had just burned through every ounce of his frustration in one burst. And yet, Keanu hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't fought back. Instead, he simply watched. The same steady, patient gaze. A look that didn't meet Victor's anger with anger. A look that didn't fight him, but saw him. And Victor felt it. For the first time, he truly felt it. The weight of every single eye in the cabin. Not watching Keanu, watching him. And what terrified him most? It wasn't judgment. It was the realization that his own outburst had just proved Keanu right. The flight attendant stood nearby, waiting, poised, ready to de-escalate if needed. Passengers sat frozen in their seats, unsure of what would happen next. But Keanu? He was still seated, still unshaken, still Keanu. And in the middle of that uneasy silence, he finally spoke. His voice low, even, firm. "I don't think I'm better than you." No smugness, no mockery, just honesty. "I just think that sometimes we need to stop and think about what really matters." A pause. Then, "And Victor, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words landed like a stone in a still pond. Not just to Victor, but to everyone in the cabin. For a moment, Victor just stared, breathing heavily. His eyes flickered across Keanu's face, searching. For mockery, for arrogance, for some sign of victory. But he found none. And that's what broke him. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of something he'd been carrying for years had just doubled. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped them against his expensive slacks. The heat of anger was gone. Now there was only exhaustion, only doubt, only a creeping realization that he wasn't winning a battle, because no one else was fighting. Slowly, almost involuntarily, Victor sank back into his seat. His eyes fell to the floor. The rage, gone. The confidence, gone. Only a strange, unfamiliar vulnerability remained. A few passengers shifted in their seats, some looking away, as if trying to give Victor back some sense of dignity. Others? They simply watched, not in judgment, but in understanding. Because whether Victor saw it yet or not, the real lesson had already been learned. The cabin sat in absolute silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that presses down on you. Heavy, inescapable, suffocating. Keanu's words echoed in Victor's mind. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Over and over again. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, so small. It was a discomfort he wasn't used to, one that stripped away the armor he had built over the years. For the first time, there was nothing left to hide behind. And what Victor didn't realize was that the worst, or maybe the best, was yet to come. The flight continued in an unsettling silence. Passengers who had once been lost in their own worlds now sat fully aware of what had just transpired. The once soft hum of conversation, the occasional clinking of glasses, the ambient noise of first-class luxury. It all seemed so distant now. Victor remained in his seat, staring ahead, unmoving. His posture was stiff, his jaw clenched, his fingers kept fidgeting with his watch. A nervous tick, a tell, and yet, still, he refused to look at Keanu, because if he did, he might have to face the truth. Meanwhile, Keanu, completely at ease. His body language relaxed, his gaze drifted toward the window, lost in thought, as if nothing had happened. Because for him, nothing had to. His actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. Then, a subtle shift, the soft click of heels against the carpeted aisle. A gentle voice, polite and professional, the flight attendant. She stopped beside Keanu's seat, her warm smile cutting through the silence. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. A ripple of curiosity. Victor's ears twitched. A few passengers turned slightly, discreetly tuning in. "The captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed," she continued. Then, the moment that changed everything. "He also sends his best regards." And just like that, the entire cabin shifted. The name Reeves rippled through the air like a sudden jolt. Passengers who had been silently observing the earlier exchange widened their eyes. Recognition dawned like a slow-rising sun. Hushed whispers began to spread, from seat to seat. Soft, incredulous voices carried through the cabin. "Did she just say Keanu Reeves? Wait, that's him? Oh my God, no wonder he was so composed." Some turned their heads, trying to be subtle. Others exchanged knowing glances, realization settling in. And Victor? Victor froze. His mind scrambled to catch up with what he had just heard. He blinked. Once. Twice. "Reeves?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. It didn't make sense. It couldn't be. His breath caught in his throat. And then, the truth crashed down like a tidal wave. Keanu Reeves. The name felt foreign on his tongue. He turned, finally, fully, completely, and looked at the man beside him, really looked at him, not as the casually dressed stranger he had spent the flight trying to belittle, but as the legend, as Keanu Reeves, the very man he had spent the last hour unknowingly trying to put down. And suddenly, every condescending remark, every insult, every attempt to teach him about power, status, and belonging, came rushing back like a cold slap to the face. Keanu, ever composed, simply nodded politely to the flight attendant. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, unbothered. The commotion around him? The growing realization? The stares? The whispers? The sudden shift in perception? None of it mattered to him. He turned to Victor, and for the first time, he addressed him directly, not as an adversary, not as an opponent in some invisible competition, but as a person. With a slight smile, Keanu tilted his head. Then, with genuine curiosity, not arrogance, not superiority, just a simple, kind question. "Is something wrong, Victor?" The words cut deeper than anything else ever could, because they weren't meant to be cutting. They were meant to be real. Victor's mouth opened, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. For the first time, he saw himself the way everyone else in the cabin did, not as the successful, powerful businessman he had built himself up to be, but as the man who had spent an entire flight trying to prove something, to someone who never needed convincing. A flush of embarrassment crept up his neck. His hands twitched. He glanced around, seeing what had changed. The passengers? They weren't watching him anymore. They were watching Keanu, with admiration, with respect, with awe. And Victor? Victor was just another man in a first-class seat, no longer the center of attention, no longer the most important person in the room. For the first time in his life, he realized that maybe he never had been. Victor stared at Keanu like he was seeing a ghost. His breath hitched, his throat felt dry, tight, and for the first time in the entire flight, he had no words. Keanu's voice cut through the thick silence. "Is something wrong, Victor?" His tone was calm, even, free of arrogance, and somehow, that made it worse. Victor opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His mind scrambled, grasping for a way to make sense of this. The Keanu Reeves, the same man he had spent the entire flight trying to belittle, the same man he had judged, mocked, looked down upon. And now the very people he had wanted to impress were staring at him, not with admiration, not with respect, but with curiosity, with amusement, with quiet disappointment. A flush of humiliation crept up Victor's neck. He sank deeper into his seat. He fidgeted with his tie, his fingers trembling slightly, trying to hold on to something that no longer felt real. Finally, after an agonizing silence, he managed to stammer. I had no idea." His voice was small, weak. He forced out a dry chuckle, but it died before it could fully form. "I mean, you didn't say who you were." He clung to the words as if they could save him. Keanu's gaze remained steady, kind, unwavering. Victor swallowed. His hands clenched into tight fists on his lap. And then, in a last, desperate attempt to justify himself, the words tumbled out in a rushed, awkward jumble. "I didn't know that you were you." Keanu simply nodded, and then he spoke, software measured. "I didn't think it was necessary." A pause, then, "I don't usually introduce myself with my name." And in that moment, Victor understood. Keanu didn't need his name. He didn't need status, power, or recognition to be respected, because his character had already spoken for him. And for the first time, Victor had nothing left to say. The cabin sat frozen. A strange, charged energy filled the space. Not of conflict, but of clarity. Victor sat rigid, unmoving. His mind raced, trying to salvage something, anything, a way to reclaim even the smallest shred of dignity. He shifted in his seat, let out a slow exhale, then finally, "Look, I didn't mean to offend you." His voice was quieter now. No bravado, no smugness, just uncertainty. I didn't know who I was talking to." Keanu let out a small sigh. Then he leaned forward slightly. His gaze was steady, understanding, but firm. And then he said the words that would stay with Victor forever. Victor. A pause. What you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. Victor felt it. A sharp, piercing truth. A realization that hit like a knife cutting through his carefully crafted persona. He swallowed, his throat tight, dry. Then, Keanu spoke again. And this time, it wasn't just for Victor. It was for everyone. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. He let the words settle. Let them sink into the bones of every person in the cabin. Then, it depends on how you choose to treat people. Victor froze. The words landed like a ton of bricks. Passengers around them exchanged quiet glances. A few nodded in agreement. The message was clear. Keanu's humility, his wisdom, his effortless grace. It hadn't just humbled Victor, it had left an impression on everyone in the room. Victor's face flushed with deep embarrassment. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to shake off the weight of what he had just heard. And for the first time, he truly reflected on his actions. Not because he had lost an argument, but because he had finally seen the truth about himself. His assumptions, his arrogance, his desperate need to prove himself. And worst of all, the realization that none of it had ever mattered. He had been fighting a battle no one else was even invested in. And now, that battle was over, and he had nothing left to fight for. Victor sat there, speechless, staring at Keanu, then at the other passengers. The weight of every single gaze pressed down on him. The humiliation was undeniable. Keanu hadn't humiliated him. Victor had done it to himself. The once impenetrable armor of arrogance and confidence he had so carefully crafted was now in pieces at his feet. The silence lingered, thick, uncomfortable, filled with unspoken thoughts and realizations. Then, Keanu spoke one last time. Not to attack, not to gloat, but to offer a truth Victor wouldn't soon forget. You know, Victor. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. The kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Life is hard enough for everyone. A pause. Then, the final truth. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down just to make themselves feel bigger. Victor's jaw tensed. His fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. But he didn't argue. For the first time, he couldn't, because the truth was too clear to deny. His shoulders loosened, the tension in his chest eased, and then, for the first time since the conversation had begun, there was something new in his eyes. Introspection, a flicker of understanding. The arrogance that had defined him mere moments ago seemed to fade. And in its place, something softer, something real. He slowly glanced around, at the passengers who had been watching him, at the subtle nods of approval toward Keanu. And suddenly, he saw it. How much his own actions had isolated him, how much his own words had alienated him, and how, in his attempt to belittle another person, he had only made himself look small. Keanu leaned back in his seat, crossed his arms comfortably, and without saying another word, he turned his gaze to the window. The conversation was over. Victor exhaled slowly. His gaze dropped to his hands, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his wealth, his status, his success. For the first time, he was thinking about who he was without them. Keanu sat at ease, relaxed, at peace, like nothing had happened. Victor, on the other hand, he was frozen, still staring at his hands. But now his mind wasn't just replaying the conversation. It was replaying everything. Every word, every insult, every assumption he had made. And the realization that came with it, it was unbearable. Because Victor had set out to humiliate someone else. And in doing so, he had exposed himself, his insecurities, his need for validation, his misguided belief that status equaled worth. all of it had been laid bare, not just to himself, but to everyone. And now, for the first time in his life, Victor had nothing to say. The rest of the flight was marked by silence. No more smug remarks, no more forced laughter, just quiet contemplation. Victor, who had once seemed to own the space with his presence, now looked small. He had shrunk into his seat, his shoulders rounded, his once confident posture collapsed, his fingers fidgeted with his cufflinks, but the movement felt empty now. Because deep inside he knew something had shifted, something he couldn't ignore. Keanu, meanwhile, remained the same, unshaken, unaffected. He radiated the same quiet wisdom that had unraveled Victor's entire carefully constructed image. There was no need for more words. The lesson had been delivered, and it didn't need any further reinforcement. The truth spoke for itself, and as Victor sat in the wreckage of his own ego, he knew it was a truth he'd never forget. The arrogance Victor had carried at the start of this flight, the certainty, the superiority, the belief that status dictated worth, it was gone. And in its place, something he wasn't used to feeling. Shame. Not the kind that comes from being caught, but the kind that comes from finally seeing yourself clearly. As the minutes ticked by, he couldn't stop thinking about Keanu's words. They had been so simple, yet they had cut through every single one of his carefully crafted defenses. They forced him to confront a truth he had long ignored. Victor's mind began to wander. Flashes of past memories surfaced. Moments where he had judged people without ever truly knowing them. How many times had he dismissed someone based on their appearance, their job, their status? How often had he sought validation through material things rather than through genuine connection? The realization hit harder than he expected. Maybe he's right, Victor murmured under his breath. He hadn't even realized he had said it out loud. Slowly, hesitantly, he glanced at Keanu. Keanu was now calmly reading a book, as if their conversation had never even happened. No resentment, no need for validation, no lingering frustration, just peace. And somehow, that only amplified the impact of everything Victor had just been through. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how much energy he had wasted. Trying to prove something, trying to win a battle no one else was even fighting. And yet, Keanu had never been fighting at all. He had simply existed, comfortable in who he was. And for the first time in a long time, Victor felt something stir inside him. Not the usual self-doubt, not the kind that breeds defensiveness, but the kind that breeds growth, reflection, change. Keanu hadn't spent a single moment trying to prove himself, not once, not with flashy words, not with defensive arguments, not with status or reputation. And yet, somehow his quiet confidence had left the biggest impact of all. The plane began its descent. The hum of the engines filled the cabin. Passengers gathered their belongings, stretching as they prepared for landing. But Victor was still lost in thought. The weight of everything he had said, everything he had done, sat heavily on his shoulders. And for the first time, he felt the need to address it, to take responsibility. Not because he had been embarrassed, not because of who Keanu was, but because he wanted to. Finally, mustering the courage, Victor turned toward Keanu. His posture was different now, his eyes lowered, his tone softer. I need to apologize, Victor said quietly. The words were difficult, but they were real. He swallowed hard, pushing past the knot in his throat. Not for what I said just because you're you. Another pause. Then, with quiet honesty. But because I was arrogant, I acted like an idiot. Keanu looked at him, really looked at him. His expression was tranquil, steady, unchanged. But this time, he let the moment breathe. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He let Victor's words settle, let him sit with them. Then finally, Keanu nodded. I appreciate the apology, he said gently. A pause, then with a quiet weight behind his words. "But more than that, I hope you learn from this." Victor nodded slowly. And this time, he meant it. The words sank in deeper than he expected. And he realized, this wasn't just an embarrassing moment. It wasn't just a humbling conversation. It was a wake-up call, a rare opportunity to reflect, to grow, to reevaluate what truly mattered. The plane continued its descent. Victor sat in silence, not out of shame, but out of something new. For the first time in a long while, he felt a desire to change, not for the approval of others, not for validation, but for himself. And as the plane prepared to land, Victor knew one thing for certain. This flight wasn't just a trip, it was a turning point. Keanu's words lingered, not just in the air, but in Victor's mind. An opportunity, a choice, one that Victor could no longer ignore. Then, in his usual calm yet insightful tone, Keanu continued, "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves." A pause. Then, the final piece of wisdom. "I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor didn't respond, but inside, something shifted. The words didn't just land. They stuck. For the first time, he felt genuinely unsure of himself, not in defeat, but in reflection. This was a moment he never saw coming, an invitation to change, to grow, and perhaps, for the first time in his life, to let go of the need to prove something. The plane touched down. Passengers began gathering their belongings, stretching, moving toward the exit. Victor followed, but everything felt different. He felt different, lighter, and yet burdened, not by arrogance, but by the realization of his own shortcomings. As he stepped into the terminal, his feet slowed. Because ahead, Keanu, moving effortlessly, unbothered, free, blending into the crowd without hesitation, without needing attention. And yet, people noticed him, not because he demanded it, but because of who he was. Fans approached, some hesitantly, others with wide, excited smiles, and without hesitation, Keanu greeted each one with patience, with kindness, with the same humility he had carried throughout the entire flight. He signed autographs, took pictures, engaged in real conversations, never rushing, never acting above anyone. Victor watched, silent. And in that moment, he realized this was what true greatness looked like. It wasn't fame. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't power. It was character. It was the way Keanu treated people, with kindness, respect, and authenticity. And the very things Victor had tried to diminish in Keanu earlier were the very things that made him extraordinary. Victor felt his chest tighten. For the first time in years, he asked himself a question he had been too afraid to confront. What had he been chasing all this time? And more importantly, why? Maybe, just maybe, it was time to redefine what success really meant. Keanu continued through the terminal, his every movement effortless, natural. There was no performance, no need for validation, just a man being himself. Victor looked down at his hands, then sighed. The weight of realization settled on his shoulders. This moment, this unexpected, humbling, undeniable lesson had changed him, and for the first time, he allowed himself to accept that. Keanu's words still echoed, a powerful reminder that a person's true worth isn't measured by status, wealth, or possessions, but by how they choose to treat others. Victor's eyes flickered back toward Keanu. But now, he was gone, blended seamlessly into the crowd. Just another traveler. Just another person in the world. Despite his global fame, he had disappeared into the sea of ordinary people because he didn't need to stand above them. And for the first time, Victor understood. Something stirred inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. Maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe this was the moment he had needed all along. A chance to start over. A chance to redefine what mattered. Victor stood there, watching the crowd move past him. And then, he made a choice to step forward, to let go of the need to impress, and instead, to become better. Not for the world, not for validation, but for himself. Because in the end, true success isn't about standing above others. It's about walking beside them. Victor took a deep breath. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward, carrying with him a lesson he would never forget. Because humility, respect, and kindness, they never go out of style. Thank you for listening to the whole story. Have a good day.